Hello, and welcome to episode number 53 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. It was at this time last year that the inaugural edition of this podcast was launched. In that very first edition, I discussed some of the broad brush topics I plan to cover in the coming weeks and months. I didn't know exactly what direction the podcast would take, but I had a strong sense that it would attempt to weave together topics that are often taken as distinct and disconnected. Topics such as alien beings and the UFO phenomenon, psi-phenomena such as psychokinesis, telepathy, and clairvoyance, and the mystery of life and death, revealed with growing clarity through phenomena such as out-of-body experiences and even more so, near-death experiences. I also understood that central to our inquiry would be the underlying role that consciousness seems to play in connecting each of these subjects, which are often collectively referred to as the contact modalities, almost like spokes in a wheel. Over time, it has become increasingly clear that, as I recently heard it put, it's not so much that we possess consciousness as that we, on the most fundamental of levels, are consciousness. Somehow, despite the temporary sense of separation we often experience in this particular earthly iteration, we are actually part of capital C consciousness, which, as quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger put it, quote, consciousness is a singular of which the plural is unknown. There is only one thing, and that which seems to be a plurality is merely a series of different aspects of this one thing, produced by a deception, the Indian Maya, as in a gallery of mirrors, unquote. While the UFO phenomenon, which has been our most central topic of inquiry, might at first seem like it doesn't belong in such a conversation, I think it's clear based on the various cases of contact with non-human intelligence that we've covered over the last year, that nothing could be further from the truth. Indeed, the connection between UFOs and aliens, with psi-phenomena and out-of-body and near-death experiences, is not even secondary and subtle, but often quite immediate and direct. In fact, we've come across cases where deceased relatives show up in the very same encounters where people meet and interact with apparently alien beings. We also know that the altered state of consciousness that experiencers of the UFO phenomenon frequently describe involves striking overlap with elements of out-of-body and near-death experiences. Now, speaking of those various experiences of contact with apparently non-human alien entities, it has been informative to see how different people have described different kinds of experiences in cases we've covered over the last year. While there are too many striking similarities to count, there have also been some striking differences, perhaps suggesting, as I've postulated for some time now, that we're dealing with different elements within one totality we conveniently call the UFO phenomenon. Now that we've reached the 1-year mark of this podcast, while also reaching the end of this calendar year, now seems like an apt time for a retrospective of sorts, looking back to compare and contrast the various elements of these otherworldly, anomalous experiences. Over the last 365 days or so, we've covered 9 specific cases of contact with alien intelligence. And now we'll seek to take an overarching view of those cases, considering in what ways they're similar as well as distinct, and in what ways they did or didn't somehow touch on the other contact modalities we discussed earlier, in this, the 53rd episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. All right, as I mentioned, in today's episode, we'll be comparing and contrasting several different cases that we specifically covered over various podcast episodes over the last year. And there are several key points we want to touch on for each of those cases. We want to make note of the type of entities encountered. We want to make note of whether or not it was a positive, negative, or neutral experience according to this experiencer. We also want to make note of the key messages that these apparently alien others communicated to this person. All right, so let's jump into our first case. These are specifically podcast episodes dedicated to a specific case, a specific encounter with aliens by a human being. The first episode we're going to look back on is episode number 8, which was titled The Visitors in Hiding, Considering Motivations Behind the Stealthiness of UFO/UAP Intelligence. Now, specifically, in terms of the cases we referred to, we talked about Suzy Hansen's case and her book, The Dual Soul Connection. Now, one of the reasons why I brought up Suzy Hansen's case in this particular episode is because we were talking about disclosure and how that may or may not be handled by human civilization, which, as I pointed out many times, is comprised of many different types of developmental levels and cultures around the world. So it's not a simple answer. This is what Suzy Hansen had to say about disclosure. Quote, "Many of us have considered the instant and potentially devastating ramifications to our civilization if disclosure takes place before we are ready. It makes sense that when the time of global disclosure comes, in whatever way it may manifest, a structure will be needed to deal with those ramifications, since it will be such a major global shift that not everyone or every societal group or organization will be able to make that leap easily." Unquote. Now, in terms of the points that we said we were going to reflect on for each case, in Suzy Hansen's case, she encountered many different types, but the most common one was the gray. And she had a specific encounter with one gray alien that she realized she knew from even childhood and before that, even between lifetimes. So what was so fascinating about Suzy Hansen's case, and it's one of my favorites, is that she reflects on so much experience with these others. Again, going back before this lifetime even. And as I mentioned in the title, she touches on the fact that she comes to recognize that she has a dual soul kind of identity. And that when she's in the realm of these others, not just on board their craft, but in that kind of altered state of consciousness that she embodies when she's with them, she comes to recognize that she's more than just human, that when she's in her human modality, it's not the totality of who she is. And again, there are other people who have acknowledged this, who have recognized this when it comes to their experience with these others. But Suzy Hansen's case is particularly interesting and informative because she has so much recall about what's been happening between her and these others. Now, in terms of whether her experience is positive, negative, or neutral, we would definitely say this is a case of a positive encounter with these others, even though, even for Suzy Hansen, her initial encounter where she was abducted with a friend, a roommate, via their car right up into an alien craft was completely terrifying. But when she was in the presence of these others, suddenly memory came back of knowing these others, and it completely changed her perspective. In terms of how she's been changed, she sees herself as part of a process, as a volunteer who's here to help facilitate an ongoing interaction with these others, and that one day when full disclosure really happens, she will serve as a bridge between them and us, even more so because she has this dual soul, human/gray identity. All right, let's move on to our next episode where we discussed a specific case of someone who had an interaction with alien beings. Now, this particular one we're going to discuss next is very unique. In fact, it's one of the most unique cases in the history of the world, I would say. And I know that's saying a lot. Here I'm referring to episode 21, which was titled The Psychokineticon, the compelling case of Ted Owens, claimed conduit for alien powers. Now, Jeffrey Mishlove actually researched this case and followed Ted Owens around and did his very best, Mishlove I'm speaking of, to document what Ted Owens did, his exploits. And what's fascinating and astounding is that Ted Owens would make these predictions of what he was going to do, these various psychokinetic activities he was going to engage in the world. For instance, manifesting a hurricane or making UFOs appear in the sky. He would say ahead of time that he was going to do this, and then many, many times, most of the time in fact, he would come through, that Mishlove would be able to actually document these things and show that somehow Ted Owens was able to predict that he was going to do these things, and then he could do them. Even feats where he controlled huge elements of nature. Now, the reason why this is a UFO case, an UFO phenomenon case, is because Ted Owens claimed that there were two specific alien entities that he was in contact with, and they had chosen him to basically manifest these powers in the world as a sort of test bed to see if human beings were ready for disclosure. Now, what's interesting with Ted Owens is that it's a bit of a cautionary tale because in some ways he didn't have the greatest level of consciousness. He was a somewhat self-conscious person, and that he got very, very angry and upset when people didn't take him seriously. But of course, this was back in the 1970s when most people in American culture didn't take psi phenomena seriously. They didn't take UFOs very seriously either in many arenas, especially in academia, for instance. So Ted Owens would take this personally, and then sometimes, either deliberately or somewhat indirectly, he would manifest phenomena that would end up hurting people. For instance, there's one specific case where a plane crashed, and it seems to be connected to something Ted Owens was doing. If you'd like to know more about that, I would suggest you go back and listen to this, episode number 21. Now let's touch on each of our key points we were going to make note of. Types of entities involved. Well, these are not your specific reptilians or greys. These were a specific type unique to Ted Owens in some ways. And in his case, he never actually had face-to-face direct contact with these aliens, but rather was in ongoing telepathic communication with them. And he was told that they were on board a spacecraft that was basically orbiting the Earth in cloaked fashion. In terms of positive, negative, or neutral, from Ted Owens' point of view, he had a very positive experience with these alien others, and he saw himself in some ways as the chosen one, almost like a biblical figure. Of course, looking from the outside, we might question whether this was a positive experience. Perhaps neutral would be a better word to use, because there was both positive and negative phenomena that arose from this case. But according to our strictest criteria, from Ted Owens' perspective, he saw these interactions as positive and his relationship with these others, these aliens, as positive. All right, let's move on to the next podcast episode that specifically discussed one encounter between a human or humans and these others, these apparent alien others. Here we move to episode number 22, which was titled UFOs in the Atomic Dawn, a discussion of Vallée and Harris's new book, Trinity, the Best Kept Secret. Now, this is a phenomenal case, and both Jacques Vallée and Paola Harris researched this specific historic case. It was about a 1945 crash, we'll say that in quotes, where a UFO apparently struck a tower and then crashed into the desert. Now, two young boys stumbled across this crash and then were able to catch sight of beings inside this crashed supposed spacecraft. Now, what's fascinating about this particular case from a historical point of view is that some have questioned whether or not it was actually a crash. That's why I used that term in quotes earlier. Because again, people wonder if an alien species is able to travel across the vast expanse of space, are they really going to crash into a tower in a small desert town? It seems like a lot to swallow. Now, from Paola Harris's and Jacques Vallée's point of view, they think this may be a coded message, that because these crashes, this one as well as Roswell later on, happened so close to the dawn of the atomic age for human beings, they wonder if actually these weren't really crashes, but ways that these others were trying to get our attention about the very dangerous precipice we were approaching with the advent of nuclear technology, atomic weapons specifically. And certainly one cannot overlook how closely this event was linked to that very first atomic bomb test. It was within weeks. It really is astounding when you think about the historical timeline. Now, this is what Vallée and Harris had to say when they reflected on this specific event. Quote, "We believe the phenomenon is not trying to teach us physics or advanced propulsion, although most researchers will keep trying to extract such data or turn it into new weapons. Instead, we believe it is trying to teach us to transcend our own humanity or perish in a toxic mental cloud of our own making when our civilization reaches its point of singularity." Unquote. So let's review our compare and contrast points pertaining to this case. Was it a positive, negative, or neutral experience for these boys that saw this? Well, that partly depends on how you look at it. They were very young when they first experienced it. One of the children was quite frightened and wanted to go home, but it certainly wasn't a negative experience overall. And what's interesting about this case, as Vallée and Harris point out, it may be more about a meta message for all of humankind rather than one specifically for these two young boys. But again, from their point of view, perhaps you would say it was a neutral experience. In terms of key messages, there were no direct, explicit messages, but again, as Vallée and Harris conclude, perhaps there are implicit messages, specifically a warning about nuclear weapons technology. All right, let's move on to our next episode that discussed a specific encounter with alien beings. Now we're going to move to episode number 23, which was titled A Spectacle in the Sky, the Events at Fatima, and the Link Between Religion and the UFO Phenomenon. Now again, just like in our previous case with the book Trinity, here Jacques Vallée is once again front and center. And Vallée talks about the overlap between religion and the UFO phenomenon. This is what Vallée has to say, quote, "Many descriptions of UFO phenomena force us to deal simultaneously with two categories we always attempt to separate, the physical or technical and the spiritual or divine. Numerous witnesses, in their statements after a close encounter, claim bluntly that the experience of the phenomenon has a religious meaning to them. Perhaps it does. Perhaps we need not only a scientific breakthrough here, but a consciousness breakthrough as well. A global historical grasp of the beliefs, materialistic as well as idealistic, among which we have been groping for 10,000 years. The famous apparitions at Fatima offer a historical example of the religious dimension of UFO encounters. The case is a celebrated one, yet I am prepared to wager that few Americans know the full story of what happened in 1917 near the small Portuguese town. I suspect that even fewer realize that the entire sequence of observations of an entity thought to be the Virgin Mary had begun 2 years previously in a fairly classical sequence of UFO sightings," unquote. And that's what's fascinating about this case, because it comes down so much to interpretation. The Catholic Church interpreted this as a vision, a manifestation of Mary, the Virgin Mary. And of course, much of the population in that area, especially at that time, around the turn of the century, was largely Catholic. So for those people, they're going to right away assume this is a vision of Mary, something to do with their religious beliefs. But again, when you compare the actual phenomena that manifested, there is much parallel with UFO encounters. And as Vallée explicitly states, there were actually classical UFO sightings that happened leading up to this event. Of course, as we've touched on many times in this podcast, this of course begs the question, could it be that our historical monotheistic religions are based on encounters that historic human beings had with these others, but just in the distant past? It's certainly a possibility. Now let's touch on our compare and contrast points. Types of entities. Well, what's fascinating about this case, and this is of course something we find very commonly with the UFO phenomenon, is different people saw different things. There were humanoid figures that were noticed, but you have to remember that people's interpretation also gets mixed into the experience, and so you're left wondering how much did they really see what they think they saw versus how much was it an interpretation that their mind formulated based on religious interpretation and religious expectation. All right, now moving to our compare and contrast points. First, was the experience positive, negative, or neutral? Well, of course, because most of these people interpreted this as a religious experience, it was seen as positive. Even though there were some stern warnings for humanity to turn from its sinning ways, lest they anger God, the overarching sense was this was God trying to turn humankind around so that we would have a more beneficial outcome. Now again, in this part of the case, it certainly begs the question because it's unclear whether or not these specific messages were beamed into the minds, so to speak, telepathically by these others, or if some kind of message came through and it was interpreted as a message from God that fit with people's pre-existing expectations for what a message from God or from an angel would sound like. It's difficult to know, especially when the people involved perhaps didn't have the self-awareness to do that kind of self-critique. Again, the initial people that saw this were young children. And we know it's already a lot to expect human beings that are adults to be self-aware enough to critique their own expectations, to see beyond that, to try and parse out their expectation from the experience itself. But when young children are involved and you're in a largely Catholic area amongst children who come from families that see everything from a Catholic point of view, worldview, then it's even more difficult. But speaking of comparing and contrasting, when we think about this case at Fatima, as well as the Trinity case we just discussed, in both situations, you could argue that a message is being delivered, but it's being delivered for all of humankind, and that the people who experience the actual entities are somewhat superfluous. It's how the experience is interpreted by the larger whole that really matters. And as Whitley and others have postulated, perhaps these others, this overarching intelligence, changes the manifestation over time to match with our current cultural expectations. So in 1917, in a small town in Portugal, it manifests like a vision of Mary, or at least it will be interpreted that way, whereas a few decades on, in the desert of the United States, at the dawn of the atomic era, a spacecraft is involved, and specifically alien-looking beings are spotted. That perhaps this overarching intelligence knows that this is what will be seen, and they have some sense of what the interpretation will be, and how the overarching society interprets that experience matters more than anything else. It's certainly worth considering from my point of view, and you could argue that this is an example of Whitley's control system, which of course we discussed way back in episode number 7. All right, let's move on to the next podcast episode that discussed a specific alien contact experience. Here we're moving to episode number 30, which was titled A Confession of Contact, the case of Robert Hastings, nuts and bolts researcher turned abductee. And as is hinted at in the title there, this is a truly fascinating case because Robert Hastings was a long-time UFO researcher, a nuts and bolts kind of individual that those who want to look at just the craft themselves looked up to. In other words, he was well known and highly respected amongst the nuts and bolts crowd specifically. Hastings didn't really touch on aspects such as hybrids or abductions or the nature of the beings themselves. He was more interested in the craft and specifically how the craft would show up at nuclear facilities, nuclear weapons facilities specifically. He has probably documented this as much, if not more, than anyone else in history. But what's fascinating about this book, which came decades after his well-known research into UFOs, and again, UFOs showing up at nuclear facilities, Robert Hastings published this book, which was a confession of sorts, coming clean about the fact that he had had ongoing lifetime memories of interaction with these beings and that he himself was an alien abductee, shocking to the UFO world. Quoting from his book, quote, "Perhaps not surprisingly, shortly after the camping trip incident, I began to wonder about certain striking thoughts, I will call them memories, that I had had as an adolescent, involving my being in a cornfield with unidentified individuals who subsequently led me into a house where I saw my entire family seated around a table, motionless and blankly staring into space. Although I hadn't thought about those vivid mental impressions for years, they now took on a new significance. After all, certain aspects of the earlier flashbacks were very similar to recent events. Memories of being taken away from my family by mysterious figures who had messed with me in some manner in a cornfield before returning me to my temporarily zombie-like kinfolk. To me, all of these apparent recollections seem to hint that an experience similar to the camping trip event may have occurred much earlier in my life." Unquote. And here specifically, Hastings is talking about a camping trip where he realizes he was abducted and how this sort of opened the door to a flood of memories going well back into his childhood. Now, of course, as many of us experience when we reflect on these kinds of experiences, Hastings couldn't help but wonder, was this responsible for his drivenness, for his drive to research and learn more about this phenomenon and to make it public news as well? Because again, he spent decades traveling around largely university campuses trying to spread the message about what he was finding, even before he came to a realization that he was an alien abductee. Quoting from his book one more time, quote, "But the question I have always asked myself is why? Why have I been driven year after year to pursue this subject with such diligence and passion?" Unquote. Now, touching on our compare and contrast points, types of entities. Well, interestingly, Hastings doesn't really remember seeing these entities specifically directly very often, if at all. He knows he has vague memories of them, and he remembers seeing kind of small figures in a cornfield, for instance, like we just talked about. But he doesn't have very specific memories of what they look like, what their facial features were like, etc. Now, was the experience positive, negative, or neutral? Well, this is complicated, as is often the case for most experiencers. Even those who come to have a positive experience, we should point out, begin as a negative experience. Because again, due to the ontological shock, which is an expression that John Mack coined, of course. When you are experiencing beings that are clearly not human and they suddenly show up in ways that seem to bend our minds, for instance, when they just manifest in our rooms or they walk through walls, this creates a degree of shock that for most is interpreted as a negative experience. So on the one hand, Hastings recognizes that this has been a very disruptive element in his life. On the other hand, he does recognize that perhaps this is in service of some greater good, that he is a messenger on behalf of these others, even if unwittingly, and his role is to help in some larger cause to turn humanity away from its use of nuclear weapons, for instance. And he has said in his book, if that's the case, then he has made peace with it. He believes it is worth it for the sake of that greater good. All right, moving on to our next case of alien interaction. We now move to episode number 36, which was titled Transformed by Contact, discussing Whitley Strieber's evolution and transformation. Now, of course, by transformation, I'm referring both to what happened to him, the evolution of his experience and his interpretation, but also the name of the book, Transformation, which was the second book in his Communion trilogy. I recommend the entire trilogy, and we will return to Whitley Strieber's books again in a future podcast. Now, Strieber has done much for human beings in terms of pioneering what it means to be an experiencer, an alien abductee. This is what Strieber has to say about abduction in his book, Transformation. Quote, "Abduction by non-human beings is part of much folklore. Whether the abductors are called demons, gods, fairies, or aliens, the experience is always devastating to its victims. Because we have refused to study the subject, we remain ignorant, and the experience is as hard now as it was 1,000 years ago. I believe this can change. Like their earlier counterparts, a few of the modern abductees have been driven mad, died, or disappeared. The great majority have simply borne their difficult, incomprehensible, and socially unacceptable memories in silence. Because it is so stressful, an encounter with the visitors can either be destructive or it can be used as a golden door to inner understanding. But it has a dark side too. People who cannot make use of their encounters are often shattered. At its best, the experience shocks minds to openness. It creates in its victims a hunger to develop and enrich their spirits." Unquote. Now, as is usually the case, there in his typical style, Strieber is very articulate in his description of what the experience is like. He points out that it is mind-bending to the extreme. It takes someone's worldview and stretches it beyond comprehension to the point of snapping altogether. And at that point, the person themselves gets to a point where they either snap or they evolve and develop a new worldview with a much deeper, broader capacity, a much deeper, broader conception of what reality actually is. Some manage to make this transition and some don't. That's Strieber's point of view. What I find interesting is that when you look at Strieber's books, they begin more with the shock and awe aspect, the complete sense of overwhelm, for instance, in his book Communion. But as time goes on, he makes more and more peace with the entire experience and recognizes, like Hastings, that it perhaps serves some purpose, and that the mind-bending nature of the experiences are somewhat part and parcel with the experience of the other, that these others are so different than us that it can't help but be mind-bending. And in that sense, he doesn't blame them. He sees it as part and parcel with the process itself, which I think is very well worth considering. So getting back to our compare and contrast points, types of entities, again, Strieber has encountered different ones, but the grays are front and center. And of course, the front cover of his first book, Communion, is the quintessential face of the alien for our entire civilization. Positive, negative, or neutral experiences, well, as I just said, that's complicated. They began as being very negative. They were certainly disruptive. But overall, Strieber has come to see it as a positive and spiritually transformative experience. All right, moving on to our next case. In episode number 38, titled A Human-Alien Symbiosis, the case of Jim Sparks and multi-generational cycles of harvest and healing, we had our next case of alien encounters. Now, much like Whitley Strieber, for Jim Sparks, the experience was extremely disruptive. It tore his life apart, basically. It certainly ended his marriage. But like Strieber and others, he came to make peace with the overall experience, and he came to understand that these others were not here to harm us, but more in service of some kind of symbiotic arrangement, which would be beneficial to both sides. Towards the end of his book, he quotes them as saying, quote, "There are some things you need to understand. Yes, it's true that we have been in contact with your government and heads of power. It is also true that agreements have been made and kept secret from your people. It is also true that in the past, some of your people have lost their lives or have been badly hurt to protect this secret. Our hands had no part in this. We contacted your leaders because your planet is in grave trouble. Your leaders said the vast majority of your population wasn't ready for anything like us yet, so we made time agreements with your leaders as to when your people would be made aware of our presence. This part of the agreement has not at all been kept. It was also agreed that in the meantime, steps would be taken to correct the environmental condition of your planet with our advice and technology," unquote. So here again, we touch on a somewhat controversial aspect of the literature behind the UFO phenomenon. This is an aspect that I myself am not sure about. It has to do with to what degree these others, some of the aliens that are part of the UFO phenomenon, have made contact, official contact, with various governments around the world, and specifically the US government. We talked about this in last week's episode. I just have yet to see evidence that is convincing either way. But nevertheless, the overarching message is very similar here again. We're very familiar with this kind of message. There is an environmental concern amongst these others of what we're doing to our planet. And according to Jim Sparks' experience with them anyway, and what he's recording here, they are willing to help us, but it is the governments of the world that are slow to act. Again, I'm unclear on that part, but the overarching message is similar to what we've heard elsewhere. So touching on our compare and contrast points, types of entities, well, this is interesting. Sparks sees different ones, but towards the end, they actually remove a kind of disguise in terms of what he thought they looked like and finds that they look more like reptilians. And they tell him they used a different guise all along so as to not overly alarm him. So reptilian is their actual form, or at least that's what they told Sparks. Now, getting to our compare and contrast points, positive, negative, or neutral. Once again, we can't help but acknowledge that it is complex. On the one hand, eventually Sparks has more of a relational dynamic with these others and sees the overarching purpose as symbiotic, not negative, not malevolent. But it was very disruptive to his life experience. His job, his marriage, etc. all fell apart. He basically became an alcoholic for years because of these experiences. So even when people do end up with positive overall interpretations, it's somewhat like the phoenix from the flame, that only by being destroyed can they then resurface with a changed personality and a changed outlook. All right, let's move on to the final case that we're going to discuss, and this is from episode number 39, which was titled The Veil Between Worlds, Yossi Ronin's Encounters with Aliens and Experience of Non-duality. Now, this is a fascinating case of an Israeli man who encountered aliens while he was living in Los Angeles as a young man. Specifically, he first had an experience with them while he was dreaming, but then to his shock, when he woke up, they were also in his manifest 3D reality. And like everyone else we've discussed, this was completely discombobulating for him. It was only by tearing apart his former view that he was able to reassemble a new conception of reality. But even then, this took many years and much introspection, including with the aid of hypnotic regression. And speaking of that, I'd like to quote from the book in a specific event where he is under hypnotic regression and trying to deal with why it is that it is so frightening to experience these others in your manifest waking world when it's not nearly as disruptive when you experience them in the dream world or the subtle realm. And in this hypnotic regression experience, even though Ronan is feeling very overwhelmed and frightened, his therapist encourages him to stay with the process. And in that process, these others share a perspective with Ronan. And this is what they say, quote, "You are afraid because the contact we have built with you, now that you are awake and conscious, face to face with us, is difficult for you. It is easier for you to experience us only through the inner consciousness, the part you call your soul, when your body is asleep and unconscious. The unfamiliar awareness you have between your body and soul. This experience is responsible for much of your body's paralysis. Since the soul is not physical like your body, it has no lifelike movements in the way that your body recognizes and exists with it. Your body does not understand this experience of total stillness. When the soul becomes aware of you through your body, you feel paralysis because your body does not know how to contain it, how to live and exist in this stillness. In terms of the physical body, which exists only within specific boundaries, to be spiritual like a soul, which has no boundaries, time, or movement, it instinctively feels like a death warning," unquote. Now, this is fascinating. I think this is a remarkable insight that Ronan comes to. And again, it speaks to the sheer ontological shock we experience in the presence of these others. And it's not often just because of the way they look, the fact that they're clearly intelligent but not human. It's not just that fight or flight response in us based on their physical appearance. It's also the way that some of them interact with us. Very often, experiencers share the fact that there is complete telepathic relay between them and us. In other words, our entire identity, our entire history, our deepest fears, regrets, shame, etc., is exposed to them. Of course, as human beings, we're not accustomed to living like this. We've built up a sheltered inner life that we keep separate from the world, separate from others. Many of these others apparently do not have this kind of experience. And to be clear, it does go both ways. Ronan can also experience all of their interiority, so to speak, as well. That's why I've coined the term total presence telepathy to describe the overwhelming sense of telepathic communication that happens between us and these others. It is not just linear thoughts shared back and forth. It is complete presence being available both ways. And because this is so overwhelming to such an astounding degree, it can feel like death. Because the small I, our small ego that has built up an identity in this iteration as an earthly vessel, is challenged to the extreme, is overwhelmed to the extreme by this experience, so much so that it can feel akin to death. That's essentially what these others are telling Ronan, and it's the realization he ultimately comes to. And again, I think this is an astonishing but highly insightful perspective. And in that sense, coming to peace with these experiences, coming to peace with being in communication with these others, is as much about reshaping and building from the ground up an experience of ourselves as it is about learning to experience and understand and live with them. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian. And I highly appreciate those who have become patrons. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.